topic of today's talk is Moore's paper, The Refutation of Idealism, published in 1903. It's a reaction against Bradley's version of British idealism, which is a kind of absolute idealism. And Moore's title leads us to expect that he's actually going to refute this view. A side note here is one of my pet peeves is the failure to distinguish between refutation and rebuttal. So you can see this confusion in lots of contemporary journalism, where when they meant to say Trump rebuts charges against him, they say refutes. Well, refutes is a success term. To refute something is to show conclusively that it's false. To rebut it is not to refute it, but rather to try to counter the claim in question that's been made. So you can rebut charges against you very easily. But if you're going to refute charges against you, you've got a big job ahead of you. In any case, Moore advertises a title that leads us to expect that he's going to refute idealism. In fact, he doesn't do any such thing. Notice, he starts out saying, I'm not going to refute idealism. Well, that's disappointing. You might say he should have picked a different title. The title grabs me. If he had said resisting idealism or something like that, maybe it would have been just as good. But in any case, he's not going to refute idealism at all. Instead, he's going to try to convince us, that if you're going to argue for this view, which it looks like you ought to be arguing for the view, you're going to have to, or most likely you're going to appeal to a premise, and that premise will be false. So instead of refuting idealism, he's going to say, look, if you just think idealism is true and you think you don't have to defend it at all, I have nothing to say to you. I can't refute your view. But suppose you undertake to argue for this view, to defend it in terms of reasons. If you do that, Moore says, you're going to have to appeal to a premise. The premise is the Berkeleyan premise. To be is to be perceived. And that premise, he's going to argue, is false. Now let's jump all the way to the end so we see where the preliminary work is going to lead us. One thing I want you to see in the work of Moore is the meticulous groundwork that he engages in all the time when he's writing. It's not really true to say, I shouldn't say all the time, because a defense of common sense doesn't have the kind of groundwork that I'm alluding to. The Refutation of Idealism has it, and Proof of an External World has it. In any case, Moore thinks, Moore's attitude expressed in the way he writes, is that you don't get to the main point of an article until you have laid a meticulous groundwork for establishing the point of the article. He tries to be as careful and meticulous in the setup as he can possibly be. So in this case, he's going to talk about the notions esse, percipi, and the copula is between esse and percipi. When we get to Proof of an External World, he's going to engage in perhaps belabored, but at least extensive investigation of the notion of an external world. That's part of the Moorean strategy. Don't just jump into philosophical ideas without looking very carefully at what the content of those ideas is. Until you understand the content of the idea, you're not in a position to determine whether the claim being made is true or false. So Moore is incredibly meticulous about this. But where are we headed? Remember, in the background, in the argument for idealism, we found this both in Royce and in other idealists, the claim that there's some non-mental stuff some purely physical, non-mental material stuff is laughable. The idea was, tell me about this non-ideal stuff. Where ideal here doesn't mean perfect, it means of the stuff of ideas. So some stuff, tell me about this stuff that is not the stuff of ideas. Call that non-ideal stuff. And then when you say, well, here's what I'm thinking about, stuff that is not in any way related to the stuff of which ideas are made, and then they find that laughable. And the reason they do is because you are describing to them an idea. And no matter what idea you're describing, it's an idea first and foremost. Now, here's where Moore is headed. We get to part 4 on my outline on the nature of ideas and sensations. So after talking about esse as percipi, he transitions to something else. Here's the quote. I pass then from the uninteresting question, is esse percipi, to the still more uninteresting and apparently irrelevant question, what is a sensation or an idea? So remember, what we're talking about is this idea we have of non-ideal stuff. An idea that seems perfectly ordinary, banal, trite, obvious. I'm looking at my coffee cup. My coffee cup is a material object. It's not an idea. It's a frickin' coffee cup. What's wrong with this idea? The idealist starts laughing and says, you're describing to me an idea. And so whatever you're describing to me has to be made of the stuff of ideas. So the stuff you're talking about can't be non-ideal stuff. Otherwise, it wouldn't be expressible in the language of ideas. Here's what Moore says about that kind of view. He says, here's what I want you to pay attention to. We should pay attention to the metaphysical, ontological, or perhaps logical structure of ideas. An idea is something that has two parts, namely what is the same and what is different. Now that's a mysterious way to talk, but think about it this way. Suppose you want to write down and represent an idea. I was talking about my coffee cup, so let's talk about that. We have both the mental state, in question. Mental states come in many varieties. You can have perceptions, sensations, beliefs, opinions, all sorts of things count as mental states. In this case, the mental state in question is just thinking about the coffee cup. So I'm thinking about my coffee cup. So let's represent the mental state in this case as T. You can think about my coffee cup. You may worry that you can't think about my coffee cup because you don't know anything about my coffee cup. But we could make it neutral and not let it be my coffee cup, but just think about a coffee cup. You can think about a coffee cup, I can think about a coffee cup, and in every case, what's the same is this aspect of consciousness. Your thinking of a coffee cup and my thinking of a coffee cup have something in common, namely the thinking. I belabor this point just because what Moore says, that consciousness is the same in every idea, is a little bit mysterious when you first read it. But what Moore is describing here is utterly mundane and obvious. So if you believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, these two things have something in common, namely, they are both beliefs. So the consciousness aspect, the mental state we're talking about in question, is the same in both of those cases. On the other hand, there is something that can be different. Now, what we were talking about was thinking about a coffee cup. If you're thinking about a coffee cup and I'm thinking about a coffee cup, the objects in question, what Moore calls the object of consciousness, can be the same thing, but they don't need to be. So, for example, let's limit it to my thinking about something. So we'll put in a subscript. In this case, I was thinking about my coffee cup, but notice this particular mental state can take a number of different objects. I can think about my coffee cup. I can think about the latest book I just finished reading. I can think about what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. There's lots of things I can think about. So let's put in a variable. My thinking can have any number of different objects as its object. Fill in the variable x with some particular value, and you can get a complete mental state in question. Mental states have what Moore calls objects. In more recent terminology, we would talk about propositional contents, or something akin to propositional contents, but Moore wants to use the word content in a different way. So let's think of a proposition as an object. A proposition is something expressed by a well-formed sentence in English. So when I'm thinking about my coffee cup, I think perhaps that coffee cup is on my desk. The coffee cup being on my desk expresses either a state of affairs or a proposition in question. It's something that is, let's say, either true or false. The coffee cup is on my desk. Now, if my perception of it is accurate, then the proposition in question is true. If I'm subject to a hallucination or illusion of some sort, then the object of consciousness in this case is false. So let's let C stand for a cup of coffee is on my desk. So here's what Moore is saying in part A. When we look at the structure of an idea or a sensation, there are two things at work. There is the mental state component and there is the object component. To be completely accurate, I would add a third component. There is the person whose mental state it is. In this case, it's mine. So if you're going to give a complete representation of an idea or sensation or any other kind of thing having to do with the contents of the mind, you need both a mental state and a person and a content. Three things. Moore focuses on two things because the personal aspect of it isn't relevant to the point he's going to make against idealism. I pointed out because if you remember when we talked about the background, the empiricist background to idealism of the 19th century, we looked at Hume. First we looked at Locke, then we looked at Berkeley crapping all over Locke's notion of substance, claiming it wasn't something, his talk about it was not something that fit into his empiricist framework at all. And Berkeley was right about that. Hume then turned the tables on Berkeley by pointing out that Berkeley's appeal to the notion of a mind was itself subject to the same kind of criticism as Berkeley gave of Locke's notion of substance. Hume is famous for saying, I looked inside myself to find myself, and all I found were the contents of ideas. All I found were sensations and ideas. The proper response to this sort of Humean chicanery, as I will like to refer to it, is look at the structure of an idea or sensation or anything else that's found in the mind. We have the kind of mental state in question, we have a person, and we have a content. So Hume looked at this whole entity, and he said, and he focused on the content of the idea and said, look, I don't find myself here. There is no content X such that X is or involves the self. The right reply to this is, you're looking in the wrong frickin' place, Hume. You are found there. So what you found was an idea or sensation or content, something mental. You found something mental. The structure of such a mental thing involves both a particular mental state and a content, but it has an identifying subscript as to whose mental state this is a mental state of. So when Hume says, I looked inside myself and I couldn't find myself, the answer is, you're just looking in the wrong place. You're looking at the content slot rather than at the person spot. So no wonder you're not finding yourself. It's like losing your cup of coffee in the kitchen when you set it down, and now you're looking outside in your yard to try to find your coffee cup. You're just looking in the wrong place. So the first point Moore wants to make is ideas, sensations, the stuff of which the mind is constituted is complex. Its complexity involves at least two parts, what you and I can share in common when we're thinking about the same thing, or we're having the same kind of mental state, and then the stuff that can be different, which is the object of consciousness. We'll drop talk about the person, the individual whose mental state it is, because that's not relevant to the attack on idealism. Here's the attack on idealism. What is different is the content of consciousness. The nature, what is different of that which exists. So here's the way Moore wants to use the word content, which is a little bit different from what is, I think, the most illuminating way to use the term. But let's take an object like your car. Your car has a color, so let's call your car A. I could use C, but I already use C for coffee cups, so let's use A. Now your car has a color. Moore wants to talk about the color of your car as the content in question. So I don't know what color your car is, but I have a car and it's black. So the content of a black car is its blackness. The content of a blue flower is the color blue. That's his use of the word content. The reason he wants a different use for this property-object relationship is because the relation between consciousness and its object is a special relation. It's not the same kind of relation as the relation between things and their properties. So we're going to talk about the property of the blackness of my car being the content of the black car, whereas the content of my idea of blue has blueness as the object of a mental state rather than its content. The reason we need to be clear about this is because that helps us realize what's wrong with the laughability response of idealists when we talked about non-ideal stuff, the idea of non-ideal stuff. If you took non-ideal stuff, let's just call that whoops, that's not an N. Non-ideal stuff. And if non-ideal stuff is stuff of which we have an idea, and we treat this in terms of properties and objects, then this is an object which has a property, the property of being ideal in some respect. So you can see how the laughability argument that the idealists use to establish the ideal nature of all of reality relies on treating this in the same way we treat the relationship between the property of being black and my car in question. More's point is this is not the right way to represent the structure of an idea. The structure of an idea is, at least for some kinds of ideas, there's a belief of mine that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's something that I believe. So let's put in a variable for this, P as a propositional variable. P is the object of this mental state of a particular person. And so the way we represent this is not that my belief has a certain property P. Remember, B will be the thing we're talking about, just as this is an idea. But the object that has a property is in the object position of a well-formed formula that attributes the property of being black to that object. So if we were going to represent the belief in question that way, we'd have to say, well, we got this belief, which is an object, and it has a property. That's pretty clearly an unilluminating and misleading way of representing what a belief is. Instead, a belief is an attitude. And the relationship between the attitude and its object is different from the relationship between an object and its properties. So we should say the right way to represent ideas or sensations is to treat the mental state in question as an operator on a propositional content P, where the operator is subscripted to the person in question. That makes the logical structure of an attribution of an idea or a mental state of any sort to a person radically different from the attribution of a property to an object. That's the fundamental character of More's attack on idealism. So when you say you've got a mental state, obviously that is something ideal in character. It's the stuff of ideas. But the mental state can be the stuff of ideas, and yet the object at which it's directed is something that's not ideal. That's the fundamental nature of More's rejection of idealism. What you have to do in order to defend idealism, More is holding, is find the ideality in the object of consciousness itself, not in the operator that you're using on that object. And More's position is fairly simple and straightforward. There's nothing in the idealist program that responds to this claim that we should represent mental states differently from the relation of objects and their properties. More's particular example for talking about that is the idea of blue. He says, so if blue is the content of an idea of blue, then the appropriate terminology to use would be to call it a blue idea, not an idea of blue. A blue idea is something that makes no sense at all, though. An idea is not the kind of thing that can be colored in any sense at all. It can't be blue or red or green or black. Grass is green, ideas aren't green. Snow is white, ideas aren't white. You can have an idea of white, but you don't have white ideas or black ideas. There are, of course, metaphorical uses of this sort of language. A black idea would be one that's dark and sinister and probably something you should not be contemplating doing. That's a dark idea. So we have metaphorical uses of these sorts of things. But in the strict, obvious, literal interpretation of it, ideas don't come in colors. Physical objects come in colors, but not ideas. So that's the fundamental point at which Moore is aiming. The relation between consciousness and its object is a different kind of relation than the relation between things and their properties. An idea of blue, then, is really an idea of blue. That means when idealists claim you can't ever get outside of the circle of your ideas, that's the laughability claim. As soon as you tell me what the content of that idea is, you're trapped in the circle of your own ideas and sensations. Moore's answer is simply just having an idea or sensation. Just in doing that, we're already connected with the world outside of our minds. If I have an idea of a coffee cup, if I have a perception or sensation of a coffee cup on my desk, I'm automatically outside the circle of my ideas because the content in question is not itself a mental or ideal thing. So let's talk quickly about the groundwork that Moore does to get us to this fundamental point about what's wrong with idealism. So first he says, I'm going to show that a premise necessary to any argument for idealism is false. That premise will be that to be is to be perceived. So he first investigates each of these notions. First, he talks about what percipi means. It might mean sensation alone, but that isn't really what the idealist is after. The idealist isn't after sensation alone, but what is common to both sensation and thought. As we might put it, he's interested in mentation broadly considered. What is it to be a mental state? So percipi is supposed to be mentation generally, not just the kind of mentation involved in the use of our senses. He doesn't spend much time talking about the notion of esse. Esse is just being, reality considered broadly, but he does spend some time on the copula. This is an important aspect of the history of analytic philosophy, is this meticulous attention to details. So when you have a use of the verb to be, in this case is, it turns out that the word is can be used in many different senses. So sometimes Moore says it's the is of identity. He says synonyms, but sometimes is just means identity, as in 2 + 2 = 4. But it doesn't always mean identity. There is the is of identity, but then there's also the is of predication. So you look over on the hill and you see something up there and you ask me, what is that thing? And I say that object, that thing is a horse. That is a horse. Now that's of course not a claim about identity, but rather of property attribution. There is an object up on the hill and it's a thing. That thing on a hill is a horse. So the horse has a certain property, being a thing on that hill. Moore calls that the notion of inclusion. There's also a stronger version of property attribution involving necessity. So if you say a bachelor is an unmarried male, you're not making an identity claim. For one thing, if you were making an identity claim, there's too many counterexamples. Some of us are male. You can't be a bachelor without being male. So let's say First, you got to be male. Second, you got to be unmarried. But look, each of us males in the world were one time 1 day old, at which point we were not yet married. We were not at 1 day old bachelors. So counterexamples to the identity claim would be really easy, but nobody thinks that's the right way to interpret the claim that bachelors are unmarried males. Instead, it's an attribution of a property, and in this case, it's a property that's necessary. Bachelors are of necessity unmarried males. So we have the is of identity, predication, and necessary predication, or as Moore calls them, synonyms inclusion and necessary inclusion. He then uses this discussion to interpret the claim that to be is to be perceived. He says that what this means is that whatever is experienced is also necessarily experienced. And then he makes the deflating remark. He can't show that this is false. If you're just committed to that view and you won't defend it or argue for it, Moore says, I can't help you. I can't show you that it's false. But some of you, he says, will try to give us a reason for thinking that this is true. Namely, that the experience of X is the same thing as X. So look at this passage. We have then, in esse is percipi, a necessary synthetic proposition which I have undertaken to refute. The only thing that we haven't talked about here is, we talked about the necessary proposition, the notion of synthetic. And here, synthetic is being distinguished from analytic. Analytic is something that would be true in virtue of the meaning of the terms involved. So bachelors are unmarried males is supposed to be an analytic truth. You only need to understand the meaning of the terms in question to see that the claim is true. Moore holds that esse is percipi is not such a claim. It's a synthetic claim. So it's not true in virtue of the meanings of the terms alone, but instead, if it's true, it needs to be a necessary truth, and that's what he thinks. That's what he's claiming underlies idealism. So it's a necessary synthetic proposition, and that's what he's taking aim at. Notice he does say, which I have undertaken to refute, and I may say at once that understood as such, it can't be refuted. So I had my sights set on this claim to show that it's false, but I really can't do that. It can't be refuted. If the idealist chooses to assert that it is merely a self-evident truth, I have only to say that it doesn't appear to me to be so. But I believe that no idealist ever has maintained it to be so. Although this, that two distinct terms are necessarily related, is the only sense which esse is percipi can have if it is to be true and important. It can have another sense if it is to be an important falsehood. I believe that idealists all hold this important falsehood. They don't perceive that esse is percipi must, if true, be merely a self-evident synthetic truth. They either identify with it or give as a reason for it another proposition which must be false because it is self-contradictory. Unless they do so, they would have to admit that it was a perfectly unfounded assumption, and if they recognized that it was unfounded, I don't think they would maintain its truth to be evident. Esse is percipi in the sense I have found for it may indeed be true. I can't refute it. But if this sense were clearly apprehended, no one, I think, would believe that it was true. Now, I want you to notice the laborious character of Moore's prose here. He really belabors a point so that you don't think he's rushing to judgment. There's no sense in which Moore, in this passage, is rushing to anything. In fact, You might think, I wish you'd get to the point. So look at the next paragraph. Idealists, we have seen, must assert that whatever is experienced is necessarily so. In this doctrine, they commonly express by saying that the object of experience is inconceivable apart from the subject. What I want you to hear here is the kind of laughability point that I was attributing to idealists in general. When you start talking about non-ideal stuff, stuff that is not made up of the stuff of ideas, they start laughing. And the reason they do is because they think the non-ideal stuff, the object of experience, is inconceivable apart from the subject. It's your idea of this non-ideal stuff. And that's why they're laughing, because what you're describing really can't be conceived apart from the fact that it's an idea of yours. I have hitherto been concerned with pointing out what meaning this assertion must have if it is to be an important truth. I now propose to show that it may have an important meaning, which must be false because it's self-contradictory. All right, so what's the argument against? Go down to section 3. Here's the passage to note. I am suggesting that the idealist maintains that object and subject are necessarily connected mainly because he fails to see that they are distinct, that they are two at all. When he thinks of yellow, and when he thinks of the sensation of yellow, he fails to see that there is anything whatever in the latter which is not in the former. This being so, to deny that yellow can ever be apart from the sensation of yellow is merely to deny that yellow can ever be other than it is, since yellow and the sensation of yellow are absolutely identical. Now remember what we just talked about the idea of a blue flower and the blue idea. A blue flower is one kind of thing, and an idea of blue is a completely different kind of thing. So, yellow and the sensation of yellow need to be represented differently. Yellow is a property. It's the kind of thing that can be attributed, well, to flowers, to cars, to pollen. All sorts of things can be yellow. But the sensation of yellow is not something that you attribute to cars or flowers or pollen. The sensation of yellow is a mental state having a content that involves the property of being yellow, attributed to something or other. You can leave it as a variable for right now because we don't know what object we're talking about. But Moore here is laboriously pointing out to people that don't have the facility with logic that we currently possess, that there's something different in the logical form of talking about the property of yellow and talking about a mental state, which is the sensation of yellow. Those two can't be the same, but they need to be the same for the laughability point to hold that idealists use to ridicule people talking about non-ideal stuff, as if that showed that idealism is false. One more quote. When therefore we are told that green and the sensation of green are certainly distinct but yet are not separable, or that it's an illegitimate abstraction to consider the one apart from the other, what these provisos are used to assert is that though the two things are distinct, yet you not only can, but must treat them as if they were not. Now I'm going to stop the quote there. What is Moore doing here? He's saying, when I point out that they're committed to the identity of yellow and the sensation of yellow, we're going to get a lot of subterfuge, a lot of verbiage intended to keep us from seeing this very clear logical point. So I'm going to talk about the subterfuge. Subterfuge is something that we shouldn't allow. As my friend Mark Lance from Georgetown says, here's where we stand up and say, I call bullshit on that. So that's what More is doing here. You're not going to be able to pull this off. So many philosophers, therefore, when they admit a distinction, yet, following the lead of Hegel, boldly assert their right in a slightly more obscure form of words also to deny it. The principle of organic unities, like that of combined analysis and synthesis, is mainly used to defend the practice of holding both of two contradictory propositions, wherever this may seem convenient. In this, as in other matters, Hegel's main service to philosophy has consisted in giving a name to and erecting into a principle a type of fallacy to which experience had shown philosophers, along with the rest of mankind, to be addicted. No wonder that he has followers and admirers. I like this passage because it is a passage where he says, I call BS on this move. You don't get to somehow both say yes and no to the question of whether identity holds. You can only make one such remark. Either it is or it isn't identical. Don't say anything, well, in a sense it is, and in a sense it isn't. That's just intellectual subterfuge. So that's More's refutation of idealism. He talks about esse as percipi. He's meticulous in laying the groundwork for talking about what it takes to show that idealism is true, show that it's false, and then he turns to the central point of the article, which is the laughability point that the idealists are relying on confuses the relationship between objects and their properties and the unique character of mentation itself, which has to be represented with a different logical form and hence a different ontological structure than that between objects and their properties. And as a result, there is a distinction between the object of consciousness and consciousness itself, so that the objects of consciousness can take us outside the circle of our own ideas, and hence idealism can't be defended by trying to identify the object of consciousness with the total composite state, which is an idea of that object of consciousness. That's the end of the refutation of idealism. In our next discussion, we'll talk about proof of an external world, which has a similar pattern to what we see here.